Hey cookies! Hope everybody's doing well today. I just have to tell you how impressive it is, how many of you are actively logging into Google Classroom and participating in the activities that your teachers have posted there. We love hearing from you, and it's not just because we know that it means that you're using your minds well and thinking and staying mentally active during this time at home, but it's also because we love hearing from you and seeing what you have to say on different topics. So keep it up. We're really, really proud of you, and more importantly, we hope that you guys are proud of yourselves. All right, today we are going to continue the work that we're doing in our cross-curricular unit with Mr. Asano on the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And today I want to look at it from the point of view of, or from the point that it is a narrative, which we talked about back at the beginning. When I say narrative, you think story. So when you are writing, if you're writing an academic essay, that's when you think about the Oliver Tootsie Pops strategy, right? That's how you organize your essay, and we'll review that in another video. When you think of a narrative, what do I want you guys to think about? Fist pows, right? Can I get a fist pow? I can hear you all saying it right now. So let's review. F, figurative language. I, ideas. S, sensory writing. T, theme. P, paragraphing. O, organization. W, word choice. S, sentence variety. S, show don't tell. And finally S, soul. So today I'm going to read aloud with you chapter 3 of this piece of literature that we're working with. And as you listen and as you follow along on Project Gutenberg, the actual text, what I'd like you to do is look for one or two examples of the fist pows, how Frederick Douglass employed them to make this a really engaging and powerful piece to read. Okay, so we're going to read chapter 3 today. Again, there's some tough stuff in here, so just kind of be aware and check in with yourself. And here we go. Colonel Lloyd kept a large and finely cultivated garden, which afforded almost constant employment for 4 men besides the chief gardener, Mr. McDermott. This garden was probably the greatest attraction of the place. During the summer months, people came from far and near, from Baltimore, Easton, and Annapolis to see it. It abounded in fruits of almost every description, from the hardy apple of the north to the delicate orange of the south. This garden was not the least source of trouble on the plantation. Its excellent fruit was quite a temptation to the hungry swarms of boys, as well as the older slaves belonging to the colonel, few of whom had the virtue or the vice to resist it. Scarcely a day passed during the summer but that some slave had to take the lash for stealing fruit. The colonel had to resort to all kinds of stratagems to keep his slaves out of the garden. The last and most successful one was that of tarring his fence all around, after which, if a slave was caught with any tar upon his person, it was deemed sufficient proof that he had either been into the garden or had tried to get in. In either case, he was severely whipped by the chief gardener. This plan worked well. The slaves became as fearful of tar as of the lash. They seemed to realize the impossibility of touching tar without being defiled. The colonel also kept a splendid riding equipage. His stable and carriage house presented the appearance of some of our large city livery establishments. His horses were of the finest form and noblest blood. His carriage house contained 3 splendid coaches, 3 or 4 gigs, besides Dearborns and barouches of the most fashionable style. This establishment was under the care of 2 slaves, Old Barney and Young Barney, father and son. To attend this establishment was their sole work, but it was by no means an easy employment, for in nothing was Colonel Lloyd more particular than in the management of his horses. The slightest inattention to these was unpardonable, and was visited upon those under whose care they were placed with the severest punishment. No excuse could shield them. If the colonel only suspected any want of attention to his horses, a supposition which he frequently indulged, and one which, of course, made the office of Old and Young Barney a very trying one, They never knew when they were safe from punishment. They were frequently whipped when least deserving and escaped when whipping when most deserving of it. Everything depended on the looks of the horses and the state of Colonel Lloyd's old mind when the horses were brought to him for use. If a horse did not move fast enough or his head was not high enough, it was owing to some fault of his keepers. It was painful to stand near the stable door and hear the various complaints against the keepers when a horse was taken out for use. This horse has not had proper attention. He has not been sufficiently rubbed and curried, or he has not been properly fed. His food was too wet or too dry. He got it too soon or too late. He was too hot or too cold. He had too much hay and not enough of grain, or he had too much grain and not enough of hay. Instead of old Barney attending the horse, he had very improperly left it to his son. To all these complaints, no matter how unjust, the slave must never answer a word. Colonel Lloyd could not brook any contradiction from a slave. When he spoke, a slave must stand, listen, and tremble. And such was literally the case. I have seen Colonel Lloyd make old Barney, a man between 50 and 60 years of age, uncover his bald head, kneel down upon the cold, damp ground, and receive upon his naked and toil-worn shoulders more than 30 lashes at the time. Colonel Lloyd had 3 sons, Edward, Murray, and Daniel, and 3 sons-in-law, Mr. Winder, Mr. Nicholson, and Mr. Lowndes. All of these lived in the great house farm and enjoyed the luxury of whipping servants when they pleased, from old Barney down to William Wilkes, the coach driver. I have seen Winder make one of the house servants stand off from him a suitable distance to be touched with the end of his whip, and at every stroke raise great ridges upon his back. To describe the wealth of Colonel Lloyd would be almost equal to describing the riches of Job. He kept from 10 to 15 house servants. He was said to own 1,000 slaves, and I think this estimate quite within the truth. Colonel Lloyd owned so many that he did not know them when he saw them, nor did all the slaves of the out farms know him. It is reported of him that, while riding along the road one day, he met a colored man and addressed him in the usual manner of speaking to colored people on the public highways of the South. "Well, boy, whom do you belong to?" To Colonel Lloyd replied the slave. "Well, does the colonel treat you well?" "No, sir," was the ready reply. "What, does he work you too hard?" "Yes, sir." "Well, don't he give you enough to eat?" "Yes, sir, he gives me enough, such as it is." The colonel, after ascertaining where the slave belonged, rode on. The man also went about his business, not dreaming he had been conversing with his master. He thought, said, and heard nothing more of the matter until 2 or 3 weeks afterward. The poor man was then informed by his overseer that, for having found fault with his master, he was now to be sold to a Georgia trader. He was immediately chained and handcuffed, and thus, without a moment's warning, he was snatched away and forever sundered from his family and friends by a hand more unrelenting than death. This is the penalty of telling the truth, of telling the simple truth in answer to a series of plain questions. It is partly in consequence of such facts that slaves, when inquired of as to their condition and the character of their masters, almost universally say that they are contented and their masters are kind. The slave owners have been known to send in spies among their slaves to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition. The frequency of this has had the effect to establish among the slaves the maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head. They suppress the truth rather than take the consequences of telling it, and in so doing, prove themselves a part of the human family. If they have anything to say of their masters, it is generally in their master's favor, especially when speaking to an untried man. I have been frequently asked when a slave if I had a kind master, and do not remember ever to have given a negative answer. Nor did I, in pursuing this course, consider myself as uttering what was absolutely false, for I had always measured the kindness of my master by the standard of kindness set up among slaveholders around us. Moreover, slaves are like other people and imbibe prejudices quite common to others. They think their own master better than that of others. Many under the influence of this prejudice think their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves, and this too in some cases when the very reverse is true. Indeed, it is not uncommon for slaves even to fall out and quarrel among themselves about the relative goodness of their masters, each contending for the superior goodness of his own over that of the others. At the very same time, they mutually excoriate their masters when viewed separately. It was so on our plantation. When Colonel Lloyd's slaves met the slaves of Jacob Jepson, they seldom parted without a quarrel about their masters. Colonel Lloyd's slaves contending that he was the richest, and Mr. Jepson's slaves that he was the smartest and most of a man. Colonel Lloyd's slaves would boast his ability to buy and sell Jacob Jepson. Mr. Jepson's slaves would boast his ability to whip Colonel Lloyd. These quarrels would almost always end in a fight between the parties, and those that whipped were supposed to have gained the point at issue. They seemed to think that the greatness of their masters was transferable to themselves. It was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed a disgrace indeed. All right, that's chapter 3. I'm going to post a couple of paragraphs on my classroom, and the question I'm going to ask you guys to answer is find a powerful pick-out that exemplifies one of the FIST POWSSS and talk about which one and why it is one of them. Be good.